The sun had barely risen over the gentle slopes of the Green Mountains, casting a soft amber light over the rolling fields and thick pines that framed the Brady family's home. It was the kind of morning that moved slowly, like a rocking chair on a porch, steady, comforting, and filled with quiet promise. Their cabin, tucked away at the edge of a forgotten gravel road outside a speck of a town called Maple Hollow, had stood for generations. Built by Tom Brady's grandfather during the post-war years, it wore its age with pride. Cedar wood faded to silver gray, a stone chimney that leaned ever so slightly, and shutters that creaked when the wind played with them. Inside, the walls were lined with old photographs, sepia-toned images of hunting dogs, snow-blanketed winters, and sunburned family reunions. The home was more than shelter, it was a memory preserved in pine and time. Tom Brady, now in his mid-40s, was the sort of man who felt most at ease with calluses on his hands and sawdust in his beard. His broad shoulders and sun-worn skin told the story of a life spent working outdoors. Once a forest ranger, he had turned to woodworking after an injury forced him to retire early. He rarely spoke unless it was necessary, but when he did, his words carried weight, grounded, like the Vermont soil he cherished. His wife, Sarah, was his opposite in energy but matched him in heart. Petite and freckled, with hair the color of rusted maple leaves and a smile that softened any hardship, she had once been a schoolteacher before motherhood became her full-time vocation. She moved through the house like a melody, humming old tunes, pausing often to check the fire or add a fresh pot of coffee. But it was their daughter, Ellie, who brought life into every corner of the cabin. Just 18 months old, Ellie was the sort of baby who didn't just crawl, she explored. With a mop of golden curls and cheeks always kissed by the cold Vermont air, she seemed made for mischief and wonder. Her laugh, bright and sudden, had become the music of the household. Her favorite companion, by far, was Milo, the family's border collie. 5 years old, Milo was a tricolor beauty, his coat a sweeping mixture of black, white, and russet brown. His amber eyes held a wisdom beyond words, always watching, always waiting. Bred from sheepdogs, Milo had an instinct for protection. He was gentle but vigilant, treating Ellie like his youngest lamb, often placing his body between her and any perceived danger, no matter how small. Mornings in the Brady home began with the smell of firewood and oatmeal, with Sarah softly humming and Ellie babbling nonsense to Milo, who listened as if it all made sense. Out here, surrounded by trees older than memory, the world moved a little slower. And in that quiet, safe rhythm of rural life, the Brady family built a peace that felt timeless, never knowing that it would soon be broken in the most unexpected way. It was one of those spring mornings that felt like a second chance at life. The kind of morning where every sound carried a softness, as though the world was waking gently after a long slumber. The trees swayed lightly in the breeze, their young leaves shimmering in the sunlight that filtered down like liquid gold. A robin chirped from the fence post, and somewhere deeper in the woods, a woodpecker tapped rhythmically against a hollow trunk. Dew still clung to the grass like tiny crystal beads, and the scent of damp earth mingled with blooming lilacs just beyond the porch. Sarah stood near the open window, folding laundry in that automatic way a mother does, her hands moving, her mind elsewhere. The dryer clunked softly behind her, and every few minutes, she'd glance through the window toward the front porch where Ellie played in her favorite spot, legs tucked beneath her as she explored a small collection of pine cones and pebbles. Tom was in the barn, working on a new cedar rocking chair commission. The sound of his hammer tapping in intervals added to the domestic harmony of the morning. Milo lay just a few feet away from Ellie, head resting on his front paws, ears twitching occasionally at a distant bird call or the creak of the porch swing. He wasn't sleeping, he never truly slept when Ellie was nearby. His eyes followed her every little motion, content but alert, like a seasoned sentinel. Sarah hummed an old tune under her breath, smiling softly at the tiny shirt she was folding. Then, the phone rang. It was one of those sharp rings that slices through a peaceful moment. She hesitated, glancing out the window once more, then stepped inside to grab it from the wall hook. A neighbor calling about a church potluck. Nothing urgent, but Sarah chatted anyway, distracted by the sound of her own voice echoing slightly in the kitchen. She didn't see Ellie set down her pinecone and crawl to the edge of the porch. Didn't hear the soft thud of her small hands landing on the dewy grass. Milo lifted his head as she made her descent, nose twitching, tail beginning to rise in slow concern. Ellie giggled at the cool touch of morning dew on her fingers and knees. Just then, a squirrel darted across the yard in a streak of gray and fluff, pausing only to chirp once from the maple tree before bounding away. Ellie's eyes lit up with the kind of innocent joy only toddlers know, and without a second thought, she followed. Her crawling quickened, awkward and determined, hands smudged with damp soil. Milo stood up, stiffening as he watched her move farther from the porch. His tail went rigid, ears perked, and then, he barked once, sharp and low, as if to say wait. But Ellie didn't stop. She disappeared into the tall grass just beyond the edge of the yard. Milo bolted after her, muscles taut, paws slicing through the morning quiet. And just like that, their quiet world unraveled. The Vermont forest was a place of hushed stories and ancient silence, a world both still and alive. Towering sugar maples stretched their limbs toward the sky, their trunks thick and dappled with pale lichen. Sunlight filtered down in broken beams, catching on the mist that lingered in the undergrowth like memory refusing to fade. Moss blanketed the rocks in velvet green, and old trails, long forgotten by human feet, wound like veins through thickets of bramble and fern. Fallen logs, slick with dew and softened by years of rot, lay like sleeping giants across the forest floor. The air was cool and damp, filled with the scent of wet bark, crushed leaves, and the faint sweetness of budding wildflowers. In the distance, a brook murmured to itself, weaving through the trees as if in no hurry to reach anywhere at all. Milo pushed through the brush, his white-tipped tail flicking with tension. His paws moved quickly but carefully, stepping over twigs and weaving through the tall grass that tickled his sides. Just ahead, Ellie crawled with relentless curiosity, her tiny hands pressing into damp earth, her knees soaked through with morning dew. She giggled now and then, drawn by the flicker of light on a patch of moss, or the rustle of leaves stirred by something unseen. Milo came up behind her and nudged her shoulder with his nose, firm but gentle, as if urging her to stop. She looked back briefly with a grin, then kept moving, pulling herself forward with the wild determination of a child who had just discovered the vastness of the world. Milo whined low in his throat, circling in front of her, trying again to block her path. She paused for a moment, then clapped her hands and giggled, as if it were all a game. He barked once, not loud, but sharp, and backed away, hoping she'd follow. But she didn't. Instead, she veered to the left, crawling beneath a drooping branch and deeper into the trees. Milo's instincts kicked in harder now. This wasn't a game anymore. The distance between them and the cabin was growing with every minute. The scents were unfamiliar. The woods were older here, wilder. A red fox slipped silently through the shadows, its sleek body a whisper against the underbrush. It paused to glance at the pair, amber eyes unblinking, then vanished as swiftly as it came. High above, an owl hooted, though it was far past dawn, and somewhere close by, the dry crack of a branch warned of deer nearby. The forest was watching, curious, still, and vast. Milo stayed close, never more than a few steps from Ellie, his gaze darting, his body tense. The moment stretched, quiet and long, and Milo understood with a certainty that cut deeper than instinct, Ellie was lost. She didn't know where she was, and no one else knew either. The forest had swallowed them. And now, it was up to him, not just to follow, but to lead her home. Back at the cabin, the stillness of the morning was broken not by birdsong or laughter but by an unfamiliar silence that pressed against the windows like a held breath. Sarah, finishing her call and setting the receiver back on the wall hook, glanced toward the porch, expecting to see Ellie exactly where she had left her, nestled near her basket of pine cones, Milo resting beside her as always. But the porch was empty. The little pile of toys lay scattered, undisturbed, and the wooden steps stretched downward into nothing but grass and morning light. A strange heaviness settled in her chest. She walked quickly to the door, stepping outside, scanning the yard. No Ellie. No Milo. Her eyes darted across the open space. The swing still rocked gently as if moved by a breeze. Ellie, she called, voice steady at first, then louder. Ellie, sweetheart? No answer. Just the rustle of leaves and the lazy sway of the birch tree in the front yard. Her heart began to beat faster. She took 2 steps off the porch and looked around more carefully. Her eyes swept from the garden bed to the old bird bath, to the edge of the woods, and then she saw it. A single handprint in the soft dirt, smudged and unmistakably small. Another a few feet away. Then, faint but clear, the 4 distinct pads of a paw. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Tom, she shouted, already moving toward the barn. Her voice cracked with urgency. Tom. She's gone, Ellie's gone. The hammering stopped. A moment later, Tom stepped into the sunlight, face drawn with confusion. What do you mean gone? He asked, already walking toward her. Sarah's voice trembled now. She was on the porch, and now she's not. She's not anywhere, she's not in the yard. And Milo's gone too. Tom's eyes darkened as he reached her side. Together, they scanned the grass, and Sarah pointed to the tracks. Kneeling, Tom traced his fingers over the handprint, then the paw. This is fresh, he said quietly. They moved together through the yard, calling Ellie's name again and again, each shout a little more frantic than the last. No giggle answered. No bark. Only the rustling trees and the steady whisper of wind that seemed to mock their rising fear. Tom stood now at the edge of the yard, looking into the trees. The forest, beautiful and benign just hours before, now loomed like a great unknown. She's gone into the woods, Sarah said softly, barely more than a breath. And Milo's with her. Her hands shook as she pressed them to her mouth, willing herself not to cry. Tom placed a steady hand on her shoulder, but she could feel the tension in him too. The forest was vast. It could swallow a grown man in silence, let alone a baby girl. They both knew time was already slipping. The search would begin. But in her heart, Sarah clung to one thin thread of hope, Milo. He had followed her. And if anyone could bring Ellie back, it was him. The forest, so gentle in the morning light, began to shift as midday crept toward afternoon. The canopy thickened above, dimming the brightness to a muted green-gray, and the breeze took on a new edge, cooler, sharper, tinged with the scent of approaching rain. Milo moved carefully, never more than a stride from Ellie, whose little hands pressed into the damp moss as she crawled over roots and stones with tireless curiosity. They had wandered far now, deeper than either of them had ever been. The world around them grew older, quieter. The birds no longer called out cheerfully from the branches. Even the squirrels had gone still. Ahead, the terrain dipped abruptly, revealing a slope slick with wet leaves and loose gravel. Milo reached it first, peering over the edge with a low, warning rumble in his throat. He turned sharply, moving to block Ellie's path just as she began to toddle toward the decline. She squealed in delight, thinking it was part of the game, and tried to scoot around him. Milo shifted again, bumping her back gently with his chest. She laughed, flopping onto her bottom, and reached out to pat his ear. His amber eyes remained locked on hers, not scolding, but firm. Slowly, she turned and crawled in another direction, and he followed, never letting the gap between them widen. Above them, the sky had changed. Rain clouds gathered in heavy layers, stacking over the mountaintops like smoke from a smoldering fire. The first shadow of thunder grumbled in the distance, low and long, as if the mountain itself had stirred. The light filtering through the leaves took on a silver-blue hue. Milo paused, ears flicking, nose twitching at the shift in wind. Then, just ahead, the sound of water, a soft babble of a creek running through the hollow. When they reached it, Milo stepped in first. The water was no deeper than his legs, but it ran quick over slick stones. Ellie reached out from the edge, touching the water with surprise, then tried to step forward. Milo circled back and stood beside her, letting her grip the longer fur near his shoulder. She wobbled, feet uncertain on the rocks, but he moved slowly, adjusting his stance to steady her. At one point, his soaked tail flicked sideways and brushed against her nose, causing her to squeal with laughter and fall into a fit of delighted giggles. For a moment, the forest held its breath, and all that could be heard was the bubbling creek and a baby's joy. But the moment faded quickly. A long, drawn-out howl echoed faintly through the trees, sharp, distant, and unmistakably wild. Milo froze. The coyote was far off, but not far enough. Another rumble of thunder followed, closer this time, and the leaves overhead began to tremble with a wind that warned of coming rain. Milo stood tall, first slightly raised, eyes scanning the tree line. He turned back to Ellie and let out a short bark, not panicked, but urgent. He bumped her shoulder with his nose, circled behind her, and gave a low growl, guiding her forward. Ellie didn't understand what danger lurked, but she felt the change in him. She followed. The forest was no longer a place to explore. It was a place to leave. And Milo, ever the guardian, knew there wasn't much time. By mid-afternoon, the cabin had become the hub of a desperate effort. Sarah stood on the porch, hands trembling as she held the phone to her ear, her voice cracking as she spoke to the ranger station. Tom paced nearby, already pulling on his old hiking boots, his expression a mask of tightly held fear. Within the hour, a green pickup bearing the Forest Service seal rolled up the gravel path, its headlights cutting through the growing mist. Ranger Dennis Harmon, a longtime friend of Tom's and a man who knew every inch of the surrounding woods, stepped out without needing to ask questions. The look in his eyes said he understood. The urgency was mutual. Minutes later, the search began. Volunteers came from town, neighbors, friends from church, even the teenage boy who bagged groceries down at the general store. They brought raincoats, walking sticks, headlamps, and warm flasks of coffee no one drank. The woods that had always felt so familiar now loomed with shadows and too many paths. The storm rolled in, slow but certain, and the first drops of rain fell like a soft warning. Flashlights swept across tree trunks and undergrowth as the forest darkened in tone and spirit. Boots squished into wet moss. Voices called Ellie's name again and again, only to be swallowed by the wind. Sarah moved with frantic precision, calling, scanning, stumbling over roots she would have noticed on any other day. The flashlight in her hand shook despite her tight grip, its beam bouncing as she pushed forward, heart thudding like a drum in her ears. Then, just as her hope began to fray at the edges, she saw something pale against the green. Caught in the brittle branch of a low bush was Ellie's stuffed bunny, one floppy ear tangled in thorns, the matted fabric darkened by rain. Sarah gasped and reached for it, hands trembling as she freed it. The familiar toy collapsed into her palm like a memory. She pulled it close, pressing it against her chest. Her voice dropped to a whisper, cracked and soaked in fear. "Please, "Milo," she murmured, closing her eyes as tears mingled with the rain. "Bring her back to me. Please bring her home." Far from the sound of voices, deeper in the trees than anyone had yet reached, Milo stood still beneath a thick hemlock. Rain dripped from the heavy branches above, each drop striking the ground like the ticking of a slow, merciless clock. He looked up once, eyes narrowing at the rolling clouds, ears twitching with each growl of distant thunder. Water streamed from his coat. Then he looked down. At the base of the tree, curled against a gnarled root, Ellie had finally given in to sleep. Her tiny frame shivered beneath her damp onesie, cheeks pale, her breath short and uneven. Milo lay beside her, pressing his body close, trying to shield her from the wind. He licked her forehead once, then lifted his head, scanning the darkened woods. He knew she couldn't go much farther. Time was slipping, and somewhere beyond the trees, the people who loved her were waiting. And so he waited too, alert, drenched, and utterly determined. Night fell without ceremony, settling over the forest like a heavy blanket pulled tight across the sky. The trees, once dappled with golden light, now stood in black silhouette, creaking in the wind like old bones. The last flickers of daylight had long disappeared behind storm clouds, leaving only the erratic bursts of lightning to illuminate the shadows. Each flash revealed more of the woods, jagged branches swaying, leaves torn loose and dancing in the wind, and in one brief instant, the unmistakable shape of a fallen tree sprawled across a narrow trail, blocking the path forward. Rain pelted the leaves with relentless rhythm, and thunder rolled over the hills with a sound like splitting stone. Milo stood beside Ellie, his coat soaked through, each breath puffing from his nose like smoke in the cold air. He sniffed the air and froze. Something moved just beyond the tree line. He barked, deep and sharp, posture stiff, tail raised. Another flash of lightning lit the scene for just a heartbeat, and in that moment, he saw it. A small bear cub, barely more than a shadow, peeked out from behind a rotting stump. Its wide eyes blinked at the light, then vanished into the brush as fast as it had come. Milo didn't chase. He stayed rooted, every muscle tensed, watching the darkness where the cub had disappeared. If a cub was near, the mother might not be far behind. But all remained still. A sharp gust of wind blew through the clearing, sending loose branches tumbling to the ground. Milo stepped over Ellie, positioning himself between her and the wind. A thick branch snapped nearby and thudded into the wet earth, just feet from where they lay. He didn't flinch. Instead, he pressed closer to her, his body a wall of warmth and protection. Ellie stirred, whimpering. Her lips quivered, her fingers curled weakly around the hem of his fur. Milo leaned down and nudged her cheek gently, then again, licking her once, then twice, coaxing her awake. She opened her eyes, disoriented, and let out a soft sob. Milo let out a quiet, rising howl, more like a song than a warning, just loud enough to keep her present, just loud enough to tell her she wasn't alone. But the storm wasn't finished. Thunder cracked directly overhead, loud enough to shake the ground beneath them. Ellie's cry became louder, shriller, fueled by cold and fear. Milo responded instinctively. He raised his head, planted his paws, and howled with all the strength left in him. It was not a fearful sound but a call, clear, commanding, and long. It pierced through the wind, cutting into the night like a flare. Then silence again, broken only by Ellie's sobs and the wind threading through the trees. Milo looked to the sky, then down to the shivering child at his side, and howled once more. Somewhere, he believed, someone would hear. Someone had to. The rain had grown relentless, cascading from the sky in sheets that blurred the trees and soaked every inch of earth below. Flashlights bobbed like will-o'-the-wisps in the darkness as the search party pushed deeper into the forest, their boots squelching in mud, voices hoarse from hours of calling. Ranger Dennis paused near an outcropping of stone, raising a hand to quiet the others. He tilted his head, listening against the wind. Then it came again, a sound sharp and strange, carrying over the storm with a clarity that defied the chaos. A howl. Not a coyote. Not a wolf. It was deeper, rounder, filled with intention. A dog's voice, crying not in fear but in signal. A call that didn't belong to the wild. Sarah froze in place, her breath catching mid-step. "That's him," she whispered. Her voice cracked as she said it again, louder this time. "That's Milo." She broke into a run before anyone could stop her, ducking under low branches, feet slipping on the rain-slick ground. Ranger Dennis and Tom followed close behind, the flashlight beams weaving together as they moved toward the sound. The forest seemed to shift around them, each distant howl pulling them closer, guiding them like breadcrumbs through the dark. And then, just beyond the base of a ridge, beneath the heavy branches of a leaning hemlock, they saw them. Sarah let out a cry that was part joy, part grief, and fell to her knees before she had even reached them. Ellie lay curled against Milo's belly, her small body trembling, her hands balled into fists against her chest. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes fluttered open at the sound of her mother's voice. Sarah scooped her into her arms, pulling her close with a sob that came from the deepest part of her soul. "I've got you," she whispered, over and over, her tears mingling with the rain that poured down her face. "Mama's here. You're safe now, baby. You're safe." Tom knelt beside Milo, one hand resting on the dog's soaked fur. Milo looked up at him, blinking slowly, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion but still shining with something resolute. Ellie stirred in Sarah's arms, and Milo leaned forward to gently lick her cheek, once, then again, as if reminding them all of the promise he'd made in silence. He had kept watch. He had stayed. And he had brought her home. Tom rubbed the side of his neck, voice thick. "You good boy," he murmured, unable to say more. The search party gathered around, silent for a moment, humbled by the sight. No one spoke. There was no need. The rain continued to fall, but it didn't matter now. What mattered was that they were found, by the one who had never stopped watching. And in the dim light of the flashlights, with Ellie pressed close to her mother's chest and Milo standing guard beside them, the forest no longer felt vast or unforgiving. It felt, for the first time in hours, like home again. The drive back to the cabin was slow and silent, headlights cutting through mist and rain as the rescue team cleared the way. Tom cradled Ellie in the back seat, his coat wrapped tightly around her small frame, her damp curls sticking to his chest. Sarah sat beside them, one hand on Ellie's back, the other reaching toward the front seat to stroke Milo's head as he lay curled on a towel, too tired to lift it but still alert. His eyes never strayed far from Ellie. Every bump in the road made her stir, and each time, he blinked as if to check she was still breathing, still warm, still safe. When they finally pulled into the gravel drive and saw the porch light glowing against the dark cabin, it felt like something sacred. Home had never looked more like a sanctuary. Inside, Tom got the fire going quickly, stacking dry logs into the hearth until the flames crackled and spilled golden light across the worn floorboards. Sarah peeled off Ellie's soaked clothes and wrapped her in the softest quilt they owned, one her mother had made years ago. She held her close in the rocking chair near the fire, whispering lullabies without words, just soft hums carried by memory. Ellie didn't speak, but she nestled deeper into Sarah's arms, fingers curled around a corner of the blanket. Milo settled next to them, his wet coat steaming slightly in the fire's warmth. His tail gave one slow wag as Sarah reached down and ran her hand gently over his back. A knock came at the door not long after. Then another. By evening's end, the house was full. The neighbors had come quietly, some still in rain gear, others in slippers and housecoats, their faces pale from worry, now lit with relief. They brought what they could: casseroles and old ceramic dishes, biscuits wrapped in tea towels, a thermos of chicken broth, and even a basket of wood for the fire. Someone laid a thick, hand-knit sweater on the bench beside the door, a mottled gray thing with awkward sleeves and a crooked hem, clearly made with love. For the hero, they said with a soft smile. The local vet, a kind woman named June, arrived with her bag in hand and knelt beside Milo. She examined him carefully, speaking to him in the soothing tones she'd used for decades. "Just some scrapes," she said to Sarah and Tom. "His front paw's a bit bruised, but nothing serious. He's tired, that's all. Let him rest. He's earned it." Sarah nodded, tears in her eyes. When everyone had gone and the cabin grew quiet again, she knelt beside Milo and wrapped her arms around him. Her voice trembled, low and full. "You're more than a dog," she whispered into his fur, holding him tightly. "You're our guardian." Milo closed his eyes, his body finally relaxing as the fire crackled behind them. And for the first time in a long while, everything felt whole. The storm had passed. The night was still. And love, that silent, stubborn thing, had once again done the impossible. In the days that followed, life at the Brady cabin slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, though something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. The woods, once so familiar, now carried a different weight, or reverence, perhaps, for what had been lost and found within them. The forest had tested them, not with malice, but with a reminder of how quickly peace can unravel and how deeply love must root itself to hold fast in the storm. As the fire crackled and spring rains gave way to the first green buds of early summer, the family began to speak of what had happened, not in loud declarations, but in quiet acknowledgments. A hand on a shoulder. A longer hug at bedtime. A glance that lingered just a second longer. They spoke most often, though, of Milo. It became clear that his courage had gone beyond instinct, beyond training. He hadn't simply followed Ellie. He had chosen her. Chosen to stay with her through cold and darkness, through hunger and fear, never once thinking of himself. There was no command, no leash, no call to action. Only love. And love, it seemed, was enough. There's something sacred about the loyalty of a dog, something so pure it humbles even the most hardened hearts. Milo had asked for nothing in return, not even recognition. But the world noticed. The town spoke of his bravery, of course, but more than that, they spoke of his devotion, how he had known, without being told, that Ellie's life was his to protect. And from that devotion, a lesson emerged, that even the smallest lives, the quietest ones, are watched over fiercely when they are truly loved. Of course, Milo's heroism did come with one unintended side effect. He now refused to let Ellie out of his sight. At all. Whether she was napping in her crib, playing with blocks in the living room, or simply toddling to the bathroom, Milo was there, sometimes just outside the door, sometimes poking his nose through the gap, earning a giggle from Ellie and a weary smile from Sarah. "It's like having a very furry babysitter," she joked more than once, though no one minded. If Milo needed to be close, they understood. After all, he had been closer than anyone when it mattered most. And so, the days passed, slow and good. Ellie grew stronger, more sure on her feet. Milo's paw healed, though he still favored it slightly, as if the memory lived there in the muscle. On a quiet evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills and the last of the light spilled into the cabin in gold and blue, Ellie fell asleep beside the hearth. Milo lay next to her, head on his front paws, eyes half closed but still watchful. Her tiny hand, relaxed in sleep, rested gently on his paw. No words were spoken. None were needed. Some heroes don't wear capes, they wear fur and walk on four paws.